Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Joshua Lambus, and today we're going to talk about the basics of photography. So if you are new to photography or you've just got a camera, you want to learn how to use it better, this is the video for you. Stick around. Should we do a intro for this video? Yeah? All right, cue intro. I am so excited to be finally doing this tutorial series. It's something I've been wanting to do for a very, very long time. If you have ever done one of my workshops, either in person or online, this is just going to be sort of a supplemental video series to that information, something that you can go back and refer to time and time again. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So there are four aspects of photography that pretty much dictate how all cameras work. And those are aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and focus. First, let's talk about focus so we can get that one out of the way. Focus is pretty straightforward. If the light coming into your camera isn't focused perfectly on the film plane or your sensor, your photo won't be in focus. It'll be blurry and essentially unusable. Now, different cameras handle focus differently, so we're not going to dive too deep into that in this video. I'm going to talk more about that in my next video where we actually discuss different kinds of cameras and how they focus. Now let's talk about how to expose your images correctly so that they aren't too bright and they aren't too dark. Exposure is largely based on three main pillars: aperture, shutter, and ISO. You may have heard of the exposure triangle. Now, I don't really like the exposure triangle because it doesn't really benefit you to visualize exposure as a triangle, so let's get rid of that. What I like to think of it more as is a linear graph, with the left being the brightest and the right being the darkest. It's not a bad idea to print out this graph and actually keep it with you when you're first starting out. This graph and more can be downloaded free of charge from my website on my workshops page. Now, each of these settings allow us to make images brighter or darker, but they also have some creative effects as well. Let's first start off with ISO. Now, ISO refers to the sensitivity of your sensor or film. Typically, it'll be numbered from something like 100 or 200 all the way up to 3200, or in some cameras even higher. This setting basically allows your camera to pick up more light. So considering all other settings are equal, the lower your ISO, the darker your image will be. The higher your ISO, the brighter your image will be. However, ISO has another effect on the image, and that is noise or graininess. Kind of creates a blurriness to your image. Now, the lower your ISO, the lower the noise, meaning the sharper your resulting image. The higher your ISO, the more noise you get, the more graininess and blurriness. So for the most part, you want to stick with the lowest possible ISO to keep your images sharp, and instead try to brighten up your image using shutter or aperture. All right, now let's check out shutter. Shutter speed is how long your sensor exposes for. Typically, it's measured in fractions of a second, like 1/1000th of a second, 1/60th of a second, and so on. It can also be much longer, like 30 seconds or even several minutes if you need that kind of creative control. Once upon a time, all shutters were mechanical, literally opening and closing to let a certain amount of light into the camera. Nowadays, there are electronic shutters, but they essentially work the same. The longer your shutter is open, the brighter the image. The shorter your shutter is open, the darker the image. 1/1000th is faster than 1/60th, 1/60th is faster than 1/15th, and so on. Now, the longer your shutter stays open, the more motion or motion blur it will capture. Most of the time, if you don't want to see motion blur in your image, you'll need to keep your shutter speed pretty fast, like 1/100th, or even much faster if you're shooting a very fast moving object, like this image, for example. I call this photo Dolphin T1000. Yes, it is a Terminator reference because it's so shiny, but also because I shot this at 1/1000th of a second. At speeds this fast, you can actually capture things like falling water, splashing water, things like that. However, the faster your shutter speed, the darker your image, and so you'll have to compensate with either your aperture or your ISO to make the image brighter. However, depending on the scene, you may actually want a little motion blur. Some things look better, like waterfalls or waves over rocks. You may want to slow your shutter speed down to 1/10th of a second or even longer, like 1 or 2 seconds. Or in some cases, you may want a really long shutter speed, like if you're trying to shoot really dim items like stars. This image was taken with a 30-second exposure. All right, now let's talk about aperture. The aperture is actually where light comes into your camera. Typically, it's a mechanical function that's inside your lens that can open to let more light in or close down to let less light in. Aperture is measured in stops of light, or f-stops. You'll see this on your lens or either on the back of your camera. Typical values are like 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and so on. Now, a wider aperture, meaning a bigger hole and more light being let into the camera, actually has a smaller f number. And a smaller aperture, meaning a smaller hole and less light coming into the camera, has a bigger f number. I know it's a little confusing, it seems backwards. I won't go into why they use those numbers in this video. Today we're gonna keep it simple. If you wanna find out more about light physics, I might make another video in the future explaining why those numbers are used. All you need to know is a smaller number means more light and a bigger number means less light. Now, aperture has another creative effect as well, and that is changing the depth of field. Basically just means how much of the image is in focus. Like in this image with a small aperture at f/22, everything is in focus. You can see the background behind the flower and it kind of makes for a busy image. Your eye wanders and it really doesn't know what the subject is. If I open up my aperture to 1.8, and now that throws the background out of focus, makes for a much more pleasing image. And that's it. Those are the main things you need to focus on if you want to understand photography a bit better. One last thing I'm going to go over in this video, and that is camera mode. Now there's three main modes in my opinion that people should use, and that's manual, aperture priority, and shutter priority. Now to switch between the different modes on most cameras, it's pretty obvious. On the top of the camera, there will be a dial that's labeled M, A, or S. Canon kind of throws us a curveball there and labels aperture AV, and they label shutter priority TV, which simply stands for time value, but honestly it's the exact same thing as shutter speed or shutter value. Now what do these modes do? Manual, as it sounds, gives you full manual control over all of the settings we just discussed. That is the setting that I'm in probably 95% of the time. I really like to tell my camera what to do as opposed to my camera telling me what to do. The priority modes, however, give priority to whatever setting you choose, and then the camera auto-adjusts the other one. Meaning if you're in aperture priority, then you'll set the aperture and the camera will auto-adjust the shutter to create the best exposure. Conversely, if you're in shutter priority, you'll set the shutter and then the camera will control the aperture to create a balanced exposure. These shooting modes can be really nice if you're in a shooting situation where the scene is changing a lot and you're having to constantly compensate for the different lighting. So for today, that's all I'm going to get into. I will make another video in the future that goes over a little more, expands on these topics, talks a little more technical aspects of the camera, things like exposure compensation, different autofocus modes, etc. But for today, we're keeping it simple. Cool, you guys. If you have any other questions about basic photography, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll jump into that comment section and try to answer anything I can. Maybe I'll make a video tutorial of it in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this. Thanks again so much for watching. I'm Joshua Lambus and we'll see you next time. Aloha.